my home never learned how to scream. It was designed for silence, the expensive, sterile silence found in high-end galleries or surgical suites before the first incision. The bleached oak floorboards didn't creak under my weight, they absorbed it, just as they absorbed my thoughts, my doubts, and eventually, my identity. For 10 years, Elias and I had been building this cathedral of doing it right. We followed the golden proportions of a successful life, jazz over breakfast, dry wine at sunset, and conversations about investment portfolios that felt more like recitations of scripture than human exchange. We were the gold standard. We were the couple our friends looked at with a mixture of envy and relief, because we were the proof that stability wasn't just a myth, it was a destination. Elias knew me at a molecular level. At least, that was the narrative we maintained. We possessed a shared lexicon of gestures, a private, silent language that rendered words redundant. At a crowded gala, he didn't need to tell me he was bored, a subtle graze of his thumb against the small of my back was the signal to call the car. I knew the specific cadence of his breath just before he woke, and the way his face smoothed out in sleep, shedding the armor of a high-powered litigator to reveal the boy he once was. We were entwined like the roots of two ancient trees, grown so close that it was impossible to tell where his strength ended and my flexibility began. But that was the trap. The architecture was too perfect. Every room was a curated museum of our achievements, the hand-thrown ceramics from that summer in Tuscany, the heavy linen curtains that blocked out the messy, unpredictable world. I began to feel like a curator rather than a resident. I would walk through the house, touching the cold marble of the kitchen island, and feel a terrifying sense of displacement. I had everything a woman was supposed to want, a man who never raised his voice, a life without friction, and a future that was laid out like a paved road through a flat landscape. The suffocation was quiet. It didn't feel like drowning, it felt like being preserved in amber. I was beautiful, I was safe, and I was utterly stagnant. I remember standing in the walk-in closet, surrounded by the scent of cedar and expensive wool, and realizing that if I disappeared tomorrow, the house would continue to function perfectly without me. My role was decorative. I was the final piece of furniture needed to complete the set of a successful man's life. Elias loved me, of course, but he loved me the way one loves a masterpiece, with a respectful, distant appreciation that never dared to smudge the paint. There is a specific kind of horror in being perfectly understood but never truly seen. Elias knew my favorite coffee bean, my dress size, and my fear of heights. But he had no idea that I spent my afternoons staring at the horizon, waiting for a storm that never came. He didn't know that the perfect life we had built felt like a cage of gold, and that the lock was beginning to rust. I was a ghost haunting my own luxury, waiting for something, anything, to break the glass. The shift didn't happen with a roar, it began as a microscopic fracture in the porcelain. It was Julian. He didn't look like a man who could dismantle a decade of stability. He looked like the city itself, a bit weathered, unapologetically raw, and pulsing with a frequency I hadn't felt in years. We were standing under the leaking awning of a transit station during a sudden, violent summer downpour. The rain turned the world into a gray blur, erasing the polished edges of the neighborhood I called home. Elias was away on a deposition in Chicago, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't being watched by the architecture of us. Julian asked for a light, then laughed when he realized my hands were empty. We started talking about the humidity, then about the absurdity of the architecture around us, and finally about nothing at all. But nothing felt like everything. Talking to him was like breathing after being underwater for 10 years. There was no shared history to navigate, no perfect wife persona to maintain. He didn't see the gold cage, he just saw me. The air between us didn't feel like the sterile, temperature-controlled oxygen of my living room. It felt like flickering neon, unstable, buzzing, and dangerously bright. When I finally returned home, the house felt different. The warm gold of our recessed lighting now looked like the jaundiced glow of an old photograph. I stood in the foyer, the scent of the city, damp pavement, exhaust, and Julian's faint tobacco and pine cologne clinging to my skin. I didn't wash it off. I went to the mirror and touched my own neck, surprised by the heat radiating from my skin. I felt a sharp, sudden awareness of my own body, not as a decorative object for Elias to admire, but as a vessel of nerves and blood. The microlies began that evening. It started with the password on my phone, a sequence Elias had known for years. I changed it while sitting on the edge of our silk-sheeted bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Then came the lingering in the driveway. I would sit in the car for 20 minutes after work, the engine idling, just to read a text from Julian. "I'm thinking about the way you look when you're thinking," he wrote. It was a simple sentence, yet it felt like a sacrilege against the 10 years of "I'll be home by 6 and did you remember to pay the gardener?" The atmosphere in our home shifted from domestic stillness to a high-voltage tension. Every time the phone vibrated at 2 a.m., the sound felt like a gunshot. I would wait for Elias's breathing to remain steady before I'd slip under the covers to check the glowing screen. The light from the phone felt like a portal to another dimension, a world where I wasn't a curator, but a participant. I began to notice things I hadn't before, the way Elias chewed, the predictable rhythm of his anecdotes, the way he assumed I would always be there, like a fixture in the wall. The static was everywhere now. It was in the way I avoided Elias's eyes during dinner, afraid he would see the neon flickering in my pupils. It was in the way I started buying clothes that were slightly too tight, slightly too dark. I was no longer the woman who fit perfectly into the architecture of our home. I was becoming a foreign object, a piece of grit in a finely tuned machine. I wasn't a villain yet, but I was something much more dangerous. I was a woman who had tasted air after a lifetime of holding her breath, and I was starting to realize I would do anything, absolutely anything, not to go back under. Maintaining a double life is not a series of grand, cinematic gestures, it is a grueling, hourly labor of managing minutiae. It is the frantic mental inventory I performed every time I stepped through our front door. Did I spray too much perfume to cover the smell of his apartment? Is there a stray dark hair on my ivory coat? Is my heart beating so loudly that Elias can hear it through the drywall? I became a master of the hollow space. I learned how to stand in the kitchen, nodding as Elias discussed the merits of a new hedge fund, while my mind was miles away, retracing the path of Julian's fingers along the ridge of my collarbone. The exhaustion was a physical entity, a gray veil that settled over my skin. I was living in the margins of my own existence. With Elias, I was a ghost. With Julian, I was a fire. The transition between the two was a violent decompression that left my ears ringing. I would leave Julian's small, cluttered studio, where the walls smelled of turpentine and old books, and drive back to our suburban fortress. The silence of the neighborhood felt predatory. I would sit in the driveway, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, trying to force the other woman back into the dark corners of my psyche so the wife could take the stage. The emotional core of my betrayal wasn't anger, it was a profound, mourning guilt. I watched Elias move through our life with a terrifying, innocent confidence. He believed in the permanence of us. He bought tickets for a concert 6 months away, he talked about where we'd retire. Every time he planned for a future, I felt like I was watching him build a bridge over an abyss I had already dug. The quiet screams started in the middle of the night. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the metallic taste of adrenaline sharp on my tongue, feeling the crushing weight of the lies stacked up like cordwood around our bed. Intimacy with Elias became an endurance test. When he reached for me, my body reacted before my mind could intervene. I would flinch, a micro-tremor of the shoulder that I'd try to disguise as a shiver. His touch, once a source of comfort, now felt like an intrusion, a bruise on skin that had been sensitized by someone else's heat. To let him touch me felt like a double betrayal. I was betraying him by being there physically while absent spiritually, and I was betraying Julian by allowing the old life to claim territory that no longer belonged to it. I was addicted to the new, to the frantic heartbeat of a secret life where every glance was a gamble. Julian was the mirror in which I saw a version of myself I liked better, braver, hungrier, less composed. But the cost was the slow, agonizing death of my integrity. I was watching the woman I used to be, the woman who valued loyalty and clarity, wither away in real time. I didn't stop to mourn her. I was too busy chasing the high of the next clandestine meeting, the next muted notification, the next hour of feeling like I wasn't just a part of the architecture. I was a hollowed-out shell, a beautiful facade held up by nothing but the tension of the lies I told myself. The disaster did not arrive with the theatrics of a thunderstorm or the cinematic crashing of plates. It arrived in the terrifyingly mundane light of a Tuesday morning, filtered through the high, arched windows of our breakfast nook. The architecture of us had always been built on a foundation of trust so absolute that it bordered on arrogance. Elias never checked my phone because he couldn't conceive of a world where I would be anything other than a permanent fixture in his life, as reliable as the rising sun or the interest on our savings accounts. But the glass did not need a sledgehammer to break, it only needed a single, microscopic crack, and I was the one who had left the door ajar. I was in the shower, the steam rising around me like a thick, white shroud, trying to wash away the phantom sensation of Julian's hands from the night before. I felt heavy, my skin sensitized and raw. Then, I heard it, the distinct, sharp ping of a notification. Normally, I was a ghost, a shadow of discretion. But the complacency of a 3-month-old secret had made me careless. Julian had a habit of sending fragments of thought at odd hours, digital breadcrumbs of a man who didn't understand the concept of a schedule. When I stepped out, dripping and wrapped in a heavy Egyptian cotton towel, the air in the bedroom had changed. It was no longer the temperature-controlled sanctuary of a luxury home. It was cold. It was jagged. Elias was standing by the window, my phone held in his hand as if it were a strange, venomous insect he had discovered crawling across our silk duvet. He didn't look angry, he looked hollowed out, as if someone had reached inside his chest and surgically removed his history. The screen was still glowing with Julian's name, and a message that was too intimate, too visceral to be anything but a death warrant for our marriage. I can still taste the salt of your skin. The silence in this room is screaming for you to come back. The confrontation that followed was devastatingly quiet. I stood there, shivering despite the heat of the shower, watching 10 years of perfect stability dissolve in the space between two heartbeats. There was no screaming, no dramatic accusations, no throwing of the hand-thrown Tuscan ceramics we had bought together in a fit of youthful romance. There was only the sound of a world ending, the sound of a vacuum forming where a life used to be. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time in years, and saw not his wife, but a stranger wearing her face. "How long?" he asked. His voice wasn't his own, it was a jagged rasp, the sound of tectonic plates grinding together. "It doesn't matter," I whispered, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding my mouth. I wanted to lie. I wanted to build the wall back up, brick by frantic brick. I wanted to tell him it was a mistake, a lapse, a momentary madness. The words died in my throat. "You cannot repair a cathedral with Scotch tape." "You aren't just gone," he said, his eyes tracing the red marks on my neck that I hadn't noticed in the mirror. "You've been erasing us for months." I was living in a house with a ghost, and I was too stupid to notice the haunting. He didn't ask who Julian was. He didn't ask why. He simply laid the phone on the bed where we had slept for 3,000 nights, and walked to the door. In that moment, I realized that I had not just cheated on a man, I had committed sacrilege against the very idea of safety. I had to choose, stay and bleed out in the wreckage of his forgiveness, or leave and burn the rest of the world down. I chose the fire. I chose the unknown. I chose to walk out of the gold cage, even if it meant walking into a blizzard. The fallout was a slow-motion car crash that lasted for months. In the movies, leaving a marriage for a lover is a triumphant escape, a breathless sprint toward a sunset of passion and liberation. In reality, it is a messy, bureaucratic dismemberment of a soul. It is the sound of lawyers' pens scratching against paper, the cold calculation of who gets the rug and who gets the memories. The lover was no longer a shimmering, neon fantasy kept in the dark, Julian was no longer a secret. He was now a person who had to deal with the grit of my reality, my tears, my sudden poverty of spirit, and the crushing weight of my absolute dependence. The flickering neon of our romance did not survive the harsh, unyielding glare of the morning sun. Once the forbidden element was removed, the chemistry changed. It's easy to be a soulmate when you only have 2 hours in a hotel bar. It's much harder when you are sitting in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment surrounded by boxes of your old life, wondering if you made the greatest mistake of your existence. Julian's studio, which had once seemed like a bohemian sanctuary, now felt small, cluttered, and perpetually smelling of turpentine and unwashed laundry. I was a creature of high ceilings and silent, expensive floors, and I found myself gasping for air in the chaos of his world. The reflection in the mirror was someone I didn't recognize. I had chosen myself over a promise, but I was beginning to realize that the myself I had found was a hollow thing. The isolation was absolute. My friends, our friends, disappeared into the cracks of the divorce. I was the villain in their narrative, the woman who had smashed the gold standard for a whim. I was the cautionary tale whispered over brunch. I looked at the ruins of my life and realized the staggering cost of my awakening. I had burned down a cathedral to build a campfire, and while the heat was real for a moment, it couldn't keep out the winter that was settling into my bones. Julian looked at me differently now, too. He didn't see the daring, mysterious woman who risked everything to be with him. He saw a woman who was mourning another man. He saw the way I winced when I heard a song we used to like, or the way I reflexively reached for a phone to call Elias before remembering I was no longer allowed to speak his name. Julian hadn't saved me. He hadn't been the destination. He was just the catalyst, the match that caught the dry wood of my boredom and turned it into an inferno. He helped me destroy what I was, but he had no blueprints for what I was supposed to become. I was free, yes, but freedom is just another word for having nothing left to hold on to while the wind howls. I live alone now, in a space that is neither a cathedral nor a studio. It is a quiet apartment with white walls and no history, located in a part of the city where no one knows my maiden name or my marital crimes. I am neither the wife I was, the polished, decorative masterpiece curated by Elias, nor the lover I hoped to be, the wild, liberated muse of Julian's sketches. Those 2 women are dead. They perished in the fire I started, and I am the someone entirely new who crawled out of the ashes. Sometimes, in the hushed, blue moments before the sun rises, I think about the architecture of that first house. I don't miss the gold cage, but I miss the girl who was innocent enough to believe the cage was a home. I miss the simplicity of a life where the greatest conflict was choosing a color for the guest room. Infidelity, I have learned, is not actually about the other. It isn't about Julian's hands or his words or the way he made me feel alive. It is a violent, clumsy act of self-mutilation. It is the attempt to murder the version of yourself that you have grown to loathe, disguised as a search for passion. I see Elias occasionally, from a distance, in the shared geography of the city. He looks older, his posture more rigid, as if he is still trying to hold up the invisible ceiling of a room that collapsed years ago. He moved on, eventually. I heard he married a woman who likes jazz and dry wine, a woman who probably doesn't have a secret passcode on her phone. We do not speak. There is no language left for us, the dictionary of our marriage was burned beyond recognition. I am a ghost to him, a cautionary ghost that haunts his better judgment. I look at my hands now, and they are steady. They don't smell of Julian's pine and turpentine, nor do they smell of Elias's expensive, clinical soap. They just smell of myself. I have lost the person I was, and in the vast, echoing emptiness that remains, I am finally learning how to sit in the silence without needing to fill it with lies or distractions. I am the survivor of my own disaster, standing in the clearing, watching the last of the smoke drift away into a dark, indifferent sky. The question that haunts the quiet corners of this new life is the only one that truly matters, the one that keeps the comments of my conscience debating into the night. I traded a life of perfect, suffocating stability for a life of honest, freezing isolation. I broke a good man to find a broken version of myself. I tore down a masterpiece to see if the canvas was still white underneath. Was the heat of the fire worth the winter that followed? Subscribe, like, and tell people about this love.